Всім добрий вечір.
On behalf of the brave.
On behalf of every father and every mother.
Wings for freedom. On behalf of our warriors.
And paves the way for a new history.
Wherever you're tuning in from, welcome to Tochnyi, on a weekend in which millions of people around the world have paused to give thanks to their veterans, have paused to commemorate the cost and the legacies of wars past, and reflected upon the sacrifices that were made and are made still to enable people to live in societies of plurality, free from the threat of tyranny and endangerment of their lives. In Ukraine, where here at Tochnyi our focus remains, a country where, as winter closes in, continues nevertheless to be where the security of European societies is being determined, where ordinary men and women are accomplishing extraordinary deeds, where, in the words of the Tochnyi epitaph, for our tomorrow they are giving their today. So please follow the Tochnyi main account on Twitter, X, or on YouTube for our latest content, and that's to come. We are open to any questions at any time, so please ask away in the chat or DM us on our X account and we will answer them. First up, we have a rundown on aid to Ukraine from Germany and France, so I will hand over to Joseph.
Thank you, Jonathan. So I will go ahead and cover the summary of the current week's German government aid to Ukraine. Monday, the Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba stated in an interview with Welt that he has no doubts that Ukraine will be part of the European Union. He had received official assurance on Sunday from Germany's Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock. Also on Monday, personnel of the State Emergency Service of Ukraine are in Germany and are being trained by the Cologne Fire Brigade on equipment and specialized vehicles to better protect the Ukrainian population against counters. Germany will also deliver corresponding equipment. Also on Monday, the German town of Gudensberg has completed their 50th relief transport mission since the start of the full-scale invasion to their Ukrainian twin city of Sturitz in Lviv Oblast in western Ukraine. They've delivered medical supplies, bandages, hygiene articles, and food. On Wednesday, Rheinmetall has received an order from the German government to supply Ukraine with around 100,000 rounds of 120mm mortar ammunition worth a low three-digit million euro figure. The delivery is scheduled to begin shortly and take place within the next 2 years. The total amount of contracted 120mm shells should be exactly 105,000 shells, as Germany officially pledged 105,000 shells to Ukraine in September. Germany, also on Wednesday, I should say, Germany is funding the work of the Norwegian People's Aid Mine Action and Disarmament Project, there we go, which is currently training mine detection dogs in Ukraine. 13 mine detection dogs have already successfully completed their training and will be on duty for the State Emergency Service of Ukraine. Also on Wednesday, the Ukrainian Minister of Education and Science, Oksan Lisovi, and the German Federal Minister of Education and Research, Bettina Stark-Watzinger, signed a memorandum of understanding and cooperation in the fields of science, technology, and innovation, and discussed details of further cooperation. This also involved the expansion of scientific cooperation and research in areas of mutual importance and common interest, and the establishment of joint operation research and innovation facilities. The more than 200,000 Ukrainian children who go to school in Germany were also a topic of discussion. The Ukrainian minister suggested would be added to the list of foreign languages taught in German schools. This would enable Ukrainian children to preserve their national identity in Germany. Also on Wednesday, Germany's federal state Saarland has concluded a regional partnership with the Lviv Oblast. Minister-President Anke Rehlinger signed the partnership with Ukraine with the governor of the oblast, Maxim Kositsky. Financial support was promised for the procurement of an operating table and endoscopic equipment for the university's surgical faculty, which operates and conducts research in the central hospital of the Lviv region. I have been not doing my slides, haven't I? There's the dogs, sorry. There's the discussion with the education ministries. And I believe we are at the mines. Okay. Oh, okay. I think I'm in the right one. On Friday, the German city of Erlangen has donated a fire brigade vehicle to its twin city of Brewery in the Kiev region. A €5,000 donation check will also be handed over shortly, which will be used to set up and equip a medical treatment room in the temporary container village for internally displaced persons there. Also on Friday, the historic moment in September 2023. So this is a historic moment. In September of 2023, German trade goods with Ukraine exceeded that with Russia for the first time. So quite a significant economic development there. Also on Friday, the EU has updated its statistics on the temporary protection of Ukrainian refugees in the EU. Between the 31st of August and the 30th of September, 19,000 Ukrainian refugees to Germany. Germany is currently home to 1.2 million Ukrainian refugees, which is 28% of the EU total. Also on Friday, Germany has donated 12 MAN 8x8 trucks, 10 trailers, and 1 crane for the transport of a field hospital, which Estonia and Iceland are delivering to Ukraine. 8 of the donated trucks were adapted in Estonia to fit the field hospital modules. On Saturday, according to Bild, Germany will double its military aid to Ukraine from 4 billion to 8 billion euros next year. The governing parties have agreed to it this week. The Bundestag's budget committee is expected to officially decide on this next week. In addition, German representatives have expressed some hesitation that supporting the EU General War Fund of $21 billion over the next 4 years. However, we at Tochnyi suspect that Germany is not interested in Hungary holding these Ukraine funds hostage in the EU budgetary negotiation and prefers this bilateral method of aid, as was done recently, where they increased it from 4 billion to 8 billion. So that concludes the main news. There's just some very slight additional news that I think we will skip for this week. Might cover if we have a lighter week next week. And just a very brief story from the French news. I saw this translated, but we just thought we would cover it. Verny Caron, the oldest French arms manufacturer and a subsidiary of the Cybergun Group, has signaled a framework contract with the Ukrainian state company Ukrspec Export for a record amount of 36 million. Thank goodness John Ridge isn't here to correct my pronunciation of that Ukrainian company. This framework contract provides the supply of 10,000 assault precision rifles and 400 grenade launchers. The execution of this framework contract is subject to the establishment of the necessary financing, which may be provided by Ukrainian and French funds, within the framework of an agreement between the Ukrainian state and the Support Fund for Ukraine. Deliveries of qualification batches are planned for early 2024. The first serial deliveries are planned 6 months after the execution of the framework contract. The delivery process will be spread over 10 months, allowing Verny Caron to adapt its production tool to the volumes committed. So that concludes the news report, the French and German news report, foreign language news report from Tochnyi for the week. Jonathan, I believe, back over to you. Maybe back over to Aaron.
We might have a microphone issue with Jonathan. I guess I can present the next speaker. In the meantime, Jonathan fixes his audio problem. We are very happy to be joined by LanguageLearner. Welcome, Language. I guess you need to unmute yourself, Language.
There we
Can
go.
you hear
The
me?
host has unmuted my microphone.
Sorry.
That might
Are
have
you
been
there?
Jonathan. Well,
Can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. And then that might have been
Well,
Jonathan's issue with his microphone as well. So
I'm sorry about that, guys. Well, welcome, Language, and thank you for joining us. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for asking, and thank you guys so much for having me. It's great to see how this has developed, and as I'm getting used to restream and YouTube and all these things, it seems you guys have put a lot of work into this, obviously.
Oh, yeah, a little bit. It's a new way of presenting and to reach different audience, and yeah, we're trying it out and failing and trying as long as we go. But I think it's going to be a good result in the end. You've been in Ukraine, but you're not there right now, are you?
Right. I left a couple weeks ago just to come back to the States to take care of some things.
But you're planning to stay in the States, or you're going back to Ukraine eventually?
My plan is to go back to Ukraine and continue the work.
That sounds good. Okay, so you've prepared a little talk for us, and I'm going to get the slides up for that. What do you plan? What do you want to talk about for us today?
Well, I think the only stuff that I can really bring to the table here today would be talking a little about sort of my experiences and in a much more general scale, the role of combat medicine in the Ukrainian military, what that looks like on the modern field of battle, and experiences with training, challenges, etc. And then answering other questions that might be pertinent to that.
Well, you can go ahead. I have a little problem with the slides for some reason, but I'm going to try and get them up as long as you go.
Sure. So I guess the first thing we can sort of talk about is, what is combat medicine, right? And how does that differ from regular medicine? Well, the answer is, at least in the United States, and I suspect in England as well, this difference between civilian and military medicine in the pre-hospital environment actually has kind of learned from each other over the last several decades. In the US, especially after Vietnam, when we realized that soldiers tended to live more if they were able to get to hospitals faster, and we started using helicopters, they found that, we need to have trained people in these helicopters, medics who are doing a little bit more than perhaps what they had done in the past. This translated into civilian medicine and really led to the rise of what you would call modern EMS, emergency medical services, paramedics, etc. So as we learn things more and more, and as the pre-hospital care becomes more and more in-depth, where a paramedic can do all kinds of things, including some very basic surgical procedures in the back of an ambulance, we realize that, we can take these skills and we can apply them to the battlefield. If you're not, you're in an austere environment, you can't necessarily get to a hospital or surgery ward. How do we take care of you then? This really crystallized around the 90s from a variety of factors. Somalia was one of them. Something called tactical combat casualty care, or in civilian world, tactical emergency casualty care. And essentially, it's 4 tiers ranging from the most basic to something for flight medics on how you can render medical care without being in a hospital setting. And as this works, we've seen it over the last several decades be instituted more and more in the American military. I imagine other NATO militaries as well. I know Germany does it quite actively because I worked with a few German instructors. And as a consequence, we've seen in Western militaries who are trained to this standard, general survivability is considerably higher than that without. And I'll get into this later, but the statistics don't lie. And there's a number of published articles on this dating back to the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, showing that those who had received this level of training, generally at that subject case, who was a U.S. Army Rangers, had a markedly less preventable deaths. If you get shot in the head, well, a bandage might not help. But if you get shot in the arm or you step on a mine, you don't necessarily have to die if you can take care of these simple things. And that's what we've seen the focus has been when we talk about military medicine. It's not necessarily the doctors and the surgeons and other medical professionals who have had years of practice and, tremendous expertise at a higher level, but the individual soldier who may not have any medical background being able to render care to themselves or others. And that was what we worked with while I was in Ukraine. We spent several months in central and eastern Ukraine, as well as a little bit in Zaporizhia, in which we trained soldiers to what's called all service members level and a little bit more. So the general basic details of what to do it can be accomplished in the span of about 8 to 10 hours with adequate practice, knowing how to keep somebody from bleeding to death, how to keep somebody breathing if they have a hole in their chest, how to successfully evacuate somebody, keep them from dying, et cetera, et cetera. And we were lucky enough to train somewhere between, I think it's in the low 4,000s of soldiers over those several months. And we noted a significant increase in combat survivability from soldiers where the entire unit or entire battalion was trained to this level, because it no longer became a role of just the medic is going to come get me. Everybody is responsible for taking care of themselves or their buddy, especially in this sort of trench-based warfare where the medic may not be in your trench. He may be a kilometer or so behind you. And then Erlen, do you have questions, or would you like me to continue?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was just stuck with the slides that bugged out on me. But I guess what are the medical kind of issues and circumstances that you mostly experienced while you were in Ukraine, and also kind of what the challenges were connected to that?
Sure. So this is an artillery war, which means that the overwhelming majority of injuries that we see come from artillery, from shrapnel, right? Pieces of hot metal flying at very quick speeds into you. And that can lead to a very different kind of wound than if you were, say, shot with a rifle, although that does happen. Generally, the people who are getting shot aren't just getting shot once. And so I'd say it'd be arguably at least 80% of the injuries are from shrapnel, if not more. This can lead to everything from big chunks of metal going through and cutting people up, or tiny little pieces like BBs that just pop into you. And then that can lead to what's called polytrauma, where you have trauma to multiple areas of your body. You might be bleeding heavily from your leg and your arm, or your neck, or your back, or all three. And so teaching people to learn to not just look at the most immediately scary and threatening thing of bleeding and then ignore everything else and move on to, okay, we've checked, we see that there was an explosion and he's lost part of his foot. Well, we're not just going to look at the foot and say, okay, well, we put a bandage on that, we're good now. You need to check their back, their sides, their neck, the whole 9 yards, because you don't know where these tiny little pieces of metal might go. That was one of the big challenges, is just getting people used to that sort of, fact that you're going to deal with multiple injuries at the same time. And then the other aspect being the long evacuation time. There's no helicopters coming to get you at the trench line, so you may have to wait, and you frequently will, for several hours before you can receive treatment at the next level of care. So it's a little bit more than just putting a Band-Aid on and throwing them in the back of a chopper. You have to sit there and manage people and be prepared to manage people and have more in-depth medical work with them.
I know Jonathan has a question. Please go ahead. You need to unmute Jonathan. Well, I guess we missed that question for now. I remember you talked about tourniquets the other day when I was talking to you, and how they can be sometimes misused and cause more damage than necessary. What are your experiences with that, and how did you approach that problem in order to make sure to save most limbs and lives?
Right. So for those who aren't familiar, a tourniquet is very broad terms. Think of it like taking your belt and putting it around your arm or leg, except you're applying it so tightly that it cuts off the blood flow through your arteries, which carry blood away from your heart, to your limbs. So that way, if you're missing, say, below your knee, you don't just have blood squirting out into the dirt. However, when you cut off blood supply away from your heart because you're applying a great deal of pressure, you're also inhibiting the ability for blood in your veins, which go back to your heart, to return. And this can lead to a number of factors in very, very broad terms. You end up with toxicity in your blood. And after a certain amount of hours, if you just take the tourniquet off and the person isn't bleeding, that more toxic blood or toxic byproducts can enter your heart and lead to cardiac issues. So that's why, then there's also other issues that happen when you starve a limb of blood. However, generally our goal is to prioritize life over limb. So if somebody says, oh, well, and this has happened in Ukraine, oh, well, the tourniquet hurts, I'm going to loosen it. Well, if they're missing half of their leg, that's probably not a good idea, right? Because, yeah, it'll hurt less, but you'll bleed out and die. However, as we talk about these shrapnel wounds, not all of them are massive bleeding. And unfortunately, in the general Ukrainian medical training that the new recruits get, it's not as in-depth and they don't get as much time as perhaps I and others would like. And so they basically just get told that you see a wound, you tourniquet it, which can be good. There's things to be worked on there. The issue is, let's say you're sitting with somebody for 3 hours, right? And it turns out that it looked scary, but you could have put some gauze in the wound to apply pressure inside and stop bleeding. And you could have wrapped it with a tight bandage, a compression bandage. And then maybe you didn't need the tourniquet. Maybe it was a small wound in the first place. However, because you left the tourniquet on for 4 hours before they were able to get evacuated, not only did that hinder their ability to walk, for instance, having a tourniquet on is quite painful. It also means that by the time they get to a hospital, especially if there's other patients, the doctors are not necessarily going to go through the whole protocol on saving the limb when it only takes 5 minutes to cut it off. So that's just a matter of, it's generally considered a more advanced skill. It's called tourniquet conversion, where you have a tourniquet on someone and their leg doesn't just fall off immediately. It takes several hours. And you say, okay, I've had this tourniquet on for an hour and a half and I've put gauze in the wound. I've bandaged it up. It doesn't seem like it's bleeding. Let's attempt to see, can I loosen the tourniquet? Is the wound stopped bleeding internally? So that was one thing that we tried to focus on as much as we could. Is generally like a day 2 skill, because you want to make sure somebody is confidently competent in the precursor skills. Unfortunately, otherwise you can lead to situations where there is excessive amputation. And that has been a reoccurring theme, as Thankfully, there are more high quality tourniquets on the battlefield, but the evacuation times are still long.
Well, thank you. And how do you ensure that the tourniquet doesn't stay on for too long? Because I mean, the soldier is probably transferred between many different people during the transition from the front lines, to they come to a medical station or an evacuation point. How do you keep track of that?
So a lot of this is actually happening at the point of injury or in the trenches themselves, is generally what we're discussing here, because the way the Ukrainian medical chain works, and I suspect similar on the Russian side, you don't always have your full combat medics, the people in the West we would consider a combat medic, in the trenches with you, because they tend to die. And especially if you're rendering care to people, you're more vulnerable. As a consequence, they tend to be further back. What I've seen in the past is you'll have 1 or 2 combat medics per about 90 soldiers. You'll have squad medics who are, and this varies depending on units and reserves and whatnot. You'll have maybe a squad medic or a platoon medic for every 30 people who can do higher level care but isn't able to, say, give people IVs or medications. And then at the front lines, it can be a bit of a grab bag. And that's where we came in, where we try to say, hey, let's move this quality of care forward. Because if you get wounded at, say, 2 p.m., sun doesn't set till 6, and you're worried about drone reconnaissance and what have you, and artillery, then a lot of the evacuations won't get done unless it's obviously emergent until nightfall. Which means even if it was a smaller wound, if somebody next to you didn't have any medical training beyond, we put a tourniquet on it and don't touch it, that tourniquet might sit there for 4 or 5 hours unnecessarily. Versus if the people in the trench itself can assess and realize, oh, this is not necessary, or we're able to replace it with this instead, and there is a protocol and process for doing so, then not only does it allow for more retention of limbs and thus greater survivability, and because there are complications from amputations, as well as people being able to get back in the fight because they have both their legs, it also makes it easier for people to evacuate if they can walk on their leg or utilize their arm a little bit more than if you've cut off the blood flow to it. Generally, by the time people are getting to the next step in terms of, like several kilometers back, they're dealing with full combat medics or whatnot, then they can also do the work, but because of those longer evacuation times, they may not be immediately present.
Yeah, so I guess Jonathan is ready with his question. Please go ahead, Jonathan.
I don't know how to do this. Mic check. 1, 2.
Loud and clear. Loud and clear.
Oh, right. Figured this out. Thank you. Thank you, Language. I was wondering if you could give us an idea of when a combat medic gets rotated out. In NATO armies, I have read that there is a degree of veteran support, post-combat support. And I was wondering how this works in Ukraine, how the mental and physical well-being of combat medics are prioritized in the post-combat phase. Is that does that happen, or does Ukraine lack this due to resources? Thanks.
It's a complex issue. As far as specifically combat medics, I do not believe, or not to my knowledge, that they receive specific, psychological help. I know psychological help is available, or psychological support is available to soldiers who are rotating back, who many frankly need it because there is a lot of trauma that people are experiencing. I have found that in all things, generally, the medics actually seem to have maybe a little bit more of a support structure from other medics, in that there's a lot of signal groups or Telegram channels or whatnot where people, it's a little gory, but either medics or nurses and doctors will sort of take pictures of injuries that they're treating and be like, hey, look at this wild injury I saw, and look what surgery I did, and look how well it worked out. There's a few that I've seen pictures of considerably, more than a few times, because people keep showing them. They're like, hey, look at this very graphic injury. And so you end up with this, I want to say gallows humor, but this sort of dark humor about it. And I think that's a common coping mechanism in the medical practices, even in civilian medicine in the States. It is a important thing, though, because there have been a number of cases, more infantry soldiers or recon soldiers that I've known of, who they get leave for a couple of weeks, they go back home, and they basically fall apart. In the idea is like, and the first time I heard it was like, okay, I guess you're done now. You're kind of having a break. You can't be functional. And then they get the opportunity to cut their leave short and go back to the front, and they do. And then they're totally fine in that environment. But when they're home, it's very off. It's a long-term process. There are a number of resources in Ukraine. If I was being cynical, I'd say they're going to need more of them. But it is something that people are monitoring actively during the war. They're not waiting till the end to try and figure out the solution to that problem.
So I got a question in DMs from a viewer, and it's basically, so I'll read it out. Language, do you have any comment on a post from Anna Filipova on Twitter, or X, as it's now called, who said the first blood transfusion has been performed in a trench in Ukraine? And the quote is, successfully performed by 12th Brigade NGU. The wounded soldier is saved and will live. And I think this is in relation to some recent changes in legislation, if I'm correct.
Yes. So getting whole blood products, really any blood products, to the front has been a huge process that has actually taken off and been a lot more successful over, I'd say, the last 6 months. But it's been multiple years. In, again, very general terms, right? This is not a lecture series. If you lose blood, well, everybody in the world dies from one thing. Doesn't matter who you are, how you die. You die from a lack of oxygen to your brain. Now, what carries oxygen to your brain is blood. If you don't have enough blood, or you're not breathing enough, then you die. Now, if you lose a lot of blood, this can also lead to lack of perfusion to all kinds of organs. It ends badly. So they have things for volume replacement, things like saline and Hextend and other drugs that can work. However, whole blood, especially of a blood type that you can use, is the gold standard. And frankly, it's part of the reason why the American military, and I suspect the German and British militaries as well, do so well with their casualty care, because they have blood supplies readily available. For instance, I'm O negative, which means I can donate and have to just about anyone. I don't know if this is the first one. I had heard rumors, because I knew that there were blood supplies with Azov and the 3rd Separate Assault several months ago. So this may be the first one done in a trench, which would be phenomenal. I believe it was already being done in ambulances and some other stabilization points by just allowing people who are not technically doctors in Ukraine, because there had been a rather old and archaic law that, honestly, a lot of misinformation got thrown up around, where people were saying, oh, if you so much as penetrate somebody's skin and you're not a trained doctor, you'll be arrested and sent to the gulag. It's not the case. There's been, I want to say, something like 20 medical malpractice cases in Ukraine in the last 15 years or something like that. I'd have to pull up the stats. And those are for gross malpractice. But soldiers are told this, as are junior medics and people who aren't physicians. They, you get a month of training or whatnot. And so they get scared and they regress to lower level skills and people die. It's phenomenal that the law has been changed. It was a long process. I commend those who worked on getting it there. And I look forward to hopefully seeing more of it in the future.
Well, it's definitely interesting, and I'm happy to hear that things are moving when it comes to these legislations that could be an hampering basically the possibility of saving lives. I think, Ukraine is changing on a lot of different aspects when it comes to their approach in the military and generally in the bureaucracy, doing a lot of radical changes. And of course, it would have been welcome to see this earlier, but I'm happy to see that it's changing. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the pictures that we have displayed on the screen. What is happening here? I understand this is training, but what are you actually training on?
Sure. So these are just a couple photos. Honestly, I didn't take a whole ton of photos while I was over there, and then we have some that just they're not as action packed because we're talking, we're training people, right? We're not running around with the camera frequently. So generally, our method of training, we're training somewhere between 30 and 45 soldiers a day in what's called ASM, or all service members care, and that's the basics that you should be expected to know. Now, there's a few things here, for instance, in the top left and top right, where it's training people how to use gauze or tamponating a wound, wound packing, if you will. The idea being that if you have, let's say you get shot in the elbow or shot in the arm, and you have a hole in you, but it's not all the way through, well, I could put a tourniquet around it, sure, and I likely will, but if I push gauze into there, then I will create pressure inside the wound cavity, and that pressure will promote clotting and it will help stop the bleeding. That's how you stop bleeding, is with direct pressure. And then you can do other things. However, that takes learning, because the Ukrainian military, and a lot of really any military dating back for 100 years now, is used to the idea of, oh, well, we're just going to have a bunch of gauze. But there's a way to apply it properly, so you're not just resting it on top of the wound, you're applying it while maintaining consistent pressure, and that takes a little bit of practice. That's some of what we're doing here. There's other skills. I think that's some other photos, things like putting people's tourniquets on, putting in what's called a nasopharyngeal airway, or something that's essentially a small tube that goes into your nostril. So even if somebody's unconscious, they can still breathe, or if they're having other sort of trauma that might indicate it. There's just generally, it's not a lot of skills. I'd say it's 6 or 7 skills overall, and then just practicing and rehearsing them, putting them together in simulations, so that way people can do them under stress repeatedly, because I'm a firm believer that if you just do something once, you're not going to understand it. You're not going to be able to do it under pressure. And if I'm just standing there shouting at you, you're just going to learn how to be stressed, right? You're not going to learn medicine. So instead, we're going to try and do the same skill 3-4 times, and then you're going to do it running around, and then you're going to do it in a trench, and so on and so forth, until it becomes automatic. So hopefully, when you need to use it, the skill is automatic.
Yeah, Joseph, you said you have a question. Go ahead, please.
Thanks, Erland. Yeah, so my question would just be, on Twitter, I've seen some interesting gadgets, right? We've seen these kind of autonomous, sort of little track-like vehicles that are designed to bring wounded back to medical areas. And then we've seen some resupply drones that exist to deliver, supplies to dangerous areas. So I guess I'm wondering if you've seen any kind of practical applications of drone technology in the medic, craft, right? I could think of maybe. My question would be: Do medical teams have and use drones, I guess, to find wounded, to bring them back, to get supplies, and if they do, is that something they control directly, or is that handled through different command, basically?
So I personally never saw anything or was told of anything regarding drones necessarily bringing people back. The idea being that those use cases can be slim. I have heard of drones being used to deliver medical supplies. Generally not things like blood, but it uses edge cases. You're dealing with a recon group or something that is further away from an established position. And so as a consequence, they don't have access to supplies. You need to deliver things to them. I never really saw anything. I know there's been talk of sort of the smaller wheeled vehicle or smaller tracked vehicle drones, and the very heavy lifting aerial drones. I hadn't heard anything about that actively being used. Drones are very useful though. And generally you'll have a element of the team, be it, especially if you're dealing with an evacuation group, and that's on a company or platoon basis, there'll be a drone available, right? So they can say, hey, we're going to set the evacuation point here. It's safe. You can go in and get them. Oh, we're going to set the stabilization point here, et cetera, et cetera. I hadn't heard about people necessarily searching, because even if you have a drone and you're going around looking for them, well, the drone itself can't do medicine. We're not at that point yet. So you do need to have a person on the ground able to render aid. And frankly, if you're going to take the time to say, oh, well, we flew a drone and we realized that Igor is, 2 kilometers away. Okay, well, now it's going to take 30 minutes to go get him. Well, that might not be enough time. So I haven't seen necessarily applied that way, more just generally for recon, strategizing, and planning, as well as just general safety and situational awareness.
Thanks.
I also have a question about equipment, and it's related to ambulances. Can you guys hear me?
Yep,
Yes.
loud and clear.
Okay. Yes. So it's related to ambulances, and I've seen multiple requests through volunteers and people on the front line asking for any sort of vehicle for evacuation, and especially during last winter, there was a lot of fundraising and people asking for ambulances and any sort of transport vehicle that could perform evacuations. And I wonder how the situation has changed since a year ago, more or less.
So I'd say on the converse of drones maybe not being as used, average trucks, cars, I have seen honestly one of the best medical evacuation things I've seen so far. Looked like it was out of Mad Max. It was basically a buggy, a dune buggy, with a bunch of a welded roll cage, an engine, plastic for a windshield, and then 2 stretchers that kind of popped out of the sides and were held there like you might see the outside of a helicopter in an old Vietnam movie. And the reason they use that specifically is because it's fast. A lot of other ambulances aren't, and the Russians very actively target medical supplies and medical stabilization points and what have you. The idea being that if you destroy a medical stabilization point, and they did this with several locations prior to the Avdiivka offensive, then you reduce morale. Because if soldiers think, oh, I'm going to die here, then they're less likely to place themselves in harm's way, right? Among other things. So ambulances are always in need. You generally have 2 levels. I'd say in general, if somebody's wounded, right? You're wounded in a trench. We'll call it, they say it's the 0 line where both sides are. And then the first line trench, second line trench are progressively further back. The 0 line trench, you take the Russian trench and they drop artillery on you. After a certain amount of time, you are evacuated to the first line trench where hopefully the squad medic, maybe if you're lucky, the company medic can work on you. After that, you need to go a further distance, right? Well, you don't want to walk the whole way. So they'll come pick you up in one of these cars or trucks or buggies or whatever they have, an armored vehicle if they can afford to use one, right? Like an M113 or another APC. At some point after that is generally where they'll stop and they'll take you directly to the stabilization point, but more frequently, they'll stop, unload the meat wagon, and give you to an ambulance, someplace that has more medical treatment options available. Even though these ambulances are kept further behind the front line, they're not you can't keep them too far behind the front line or they won't get there in time. And so that's why it can be quite dangerous for them, as well as, frankly, stabilization points, because the Russians do have drones and they see, oh, there's an ambulance parked outside here. We see that every time we wound soldiers, that they end up traveling in this area. We see ambulances stopping here. Let's hit that building. As they frequently do, it can lead to more damage and destruction of medical supplies. I'd say the need is consistent. However, you also need to have, in a perfect world, armored vehicles, something that can load people up under artillery fire. And in a less perfect world, just regular cars and trucks and vans, so you don't have to be stuck hoofing it for multiple kilometers.
Well, so that's kind of a controversial subject, because in general, Western armies tend to mark any stabilization point and field hospitals, ambulances, very visible. So because you want to respect the Geneva Convention, which basically prevents the attack on ambulances and medical facilities. So at this point, it seems like Ukraine rather have to actually conceal what is a medical outpost. Is that how they're doing it? Is there operational security? I guess there is, to the same degree as in any other military target, because of this issue.
Absolutely. So one of the first things that had happened to us when it was not my first time in Donetsk, but I was going out with my team for the first time down there. And many of them hadn't been there. We were using a vehicle that was bright white and red, right? Looked like an ambulance, big van. Get down there, and the medic who had been in East for some time looks at us and goes, "What the hell's wrong with you guys? You can't get us all killed." So he covered it up with camouflage and went on our way. But it is a consistent threat. The Russians will absolutely target medical points. It's not even like this happened once and I heard about it. It's a consistent threat. The idea being that this is how you can render the Ukrainian army less mobile, less morale, whatever. I mean, we don't even have to look for, broad examples. Look at Azovstal. I actually had the pleasure of talking with a guy who had been a medic in Azovstal and was later released as part of a prisoner transfer from the Marines. And through a translator, he was talking about how really the thing that marked the end of that siege was the lack of medical supplies. Because people can fight on with limited ammo, and in a lot of cases do, or perhaps, challenges with food and water, and they had some supplies there. But the Russians were using bunker busters to target the hospitals. There was essentially 3 little clinics underneath in the bunker, and I believe after 2 of them were destroyed and the medical people inside were killed, as well as the supplies, if you're sitting there watching your arm fall off because you don't have antibiotics, well, you're going to have to make a decision, right? So this has been part of the Russian playbook in this war since the very beginning, arguably since 2014, and I wouldn't be surprised that it's at all. Frankly, I would be more surprised if the Russians stopped doing it. They will target evacuations consistently with artillery. They'll target evacuation vehicles, and they'll target the stabilization points. Are you aware of any concerted international push to fulfill the needs of the combat medics vehicle issues? It seems like vehicles are a hot commodity. It seems it could be an easier request. So the thing is, everybody needs a vehicle, right? And so vehicles can be very disposable at the front line. I've seen vehicles push well past their breaking point. And thank you for the question, Swidgen. The issue being that if something doesn't start and you're near the zero line or front line, if you're in, you don't have time to stick around and fix it. And we've all seen videos of people dropping grenades from drones onto stationary vehicles. You leave something there overnight, you're not going to have a good time. So as a consequence, let me move my cat. As a consequence, they tend to go through these. And also, frankly, there's just not a lot of maintenance getting done. The mechanic shops near the front line are constantly overbooked. Supplies can be very limited, and people, they're trying to get the most out of these things. So it's not like you're getting oil changes every, 10,000 kilometers or anything like that, right? You're getting oil changes when you can. And as a consequence, and things are being driven hard, there's a lot of dust, you end up with a lot of wear and tear, even secondary to just having a drone hit you with an explosive. And if you follow Andrew Perpetua's counts day by day, you can see how many of the destroyed vehicles and destroyed equipment comes from drone attacks. And as a consequence, how many of them are things like trucks and cars. I've seen exactly what that looks like with a Nissan pickup truck. And just the guys were lucky, and it hit on the back side of the bed rather than near the front. But it still threw shrapnel through a decent part of the vehicle. And the guys were lucky that it didn't take their head off. So it's a very lethal environment in modern war. And as a consequence, you burn through supplies, be they medical supplies or transportation, very quickly, especially if you're actively using them in a dangerous area.
Yeah, and thank you to the viewer for the question. Please feel free to comment with questions as we go. I wanted to ask you, Language, about your time over there. You experienced some difficulties, and I guess in general you're going back. So I guess you have positive experiences as well from Ukraine, but it wasn't just a dance on roses over there, was it?
Unfortunately, no. Now, let me be clear, I was never sitting in a trench at the zero line getting shelled. I would try to stay away from that. I'm a non-combatant. No need to carry a weapon. And frankly, I would get in the way up there. So we were generally a couple kilometers back because, unfortunately, my experience, and this is changing, thankfully, and I'm not just saying that as a platitude. There's been some good news in the last week or two as Ukraine is sort of working to develop its medical corps a little bit more. The average Ukrainian army soldier doesn't get extensive medical training. They get arguably a translated PowerPoint from the US. It's about 47 pages, maybe 90 minutes, and their medic goes, hey, this is everything you should have in your first aid kit, your IFAK, your Aptichka, whatever you want to call it, and go get it yourself, and good luck. Go get the tourniquet. And no, you can't have mine. I'm the medic, and these are expensive, right? Because a cat tourniquet in Ukraine can cost like $43, which is considerable when the average soldier is making far less than that, making like $800 a month. So when they're not at the front. So the lack of training leads to increased unnecessary death, and that can be very frustrating. And so that's why I originally went there. I said, I'm going to train everybody that I meet to this higher level, this tier 2, 2.5 out of 4, right? We're not going to make everybody a medic. We're going to make them close. And I realized, well, we need to focus on the basics first because a lot of these soldiers don't have the time to go and leave and go back to, say, Kyiv, or certainly not Lviv, maybe not even Kharkiv, and take a week to do training, right? Because they're getting pulled out of the trenches to come to your class. And then they're going back to those trenches that same night. And if you say, oh, well, I need your best guys to take them for a month to teach them how to be medics, the commander's going to laugh in your face and go, okay, you want to teach them to be snipers and paratroopers at the same time. I can't spare them for a month. So you have to kind of go where the need is, which means you're now dealing with a more resource-starved environment. I mean, I don't think I taught in a classroom for outside of like 2 days in the East, and that was because it was like torrential rain and drones one day. Otherwise, it's always outside. We were using stolen Russian stretchers as things to keep stuff from getting destroyed, and just using what limited resources we have. You don't have a PowerPoint presentation. We were very lucky to work with some phenomenal units who had great translators, but it can be very frustrating, challenging. I'd say generally we were very lucky. We worked with a number of different brigades. Generally, soldiers who have seen combat are very appreciative and want to learn this sort of thing. I did find, and this was more true when we were doing some trainings around Kyiv, soldiers who have not seen combat, and not to talk them down too much, but certain police departments who sort of came in because they said, hey, we need to get this training to check off a box. They're less enthusiastic about learning, and you just kind of have to find ways to motivate them without shouting, because I'm a firm believer that if I have to scream at you for you to learn something, then we're wasting both of our times, and you're not going to learn anything. I saw individuals who tried to teach that way, and the Ukrainians would literally just turn their back and walk. It's like, I'm not going to be sat here and talked to like a child by a person coming to my country to teach me something in a language I don't understand, which is fair. So you have to balance all of that. But when you get a good group, it is that feels great, man. It's incredibly motivating and impactful, because I never really shared contact information with the soldiers because soldiers die. But I talk to their commanders, because then I say, hey, like, how did this work? Well, I'm not just throwing this out into the ether and forgetting about it. Did this have positive effects? And you get a message back that says, hey, the guy's morale has improved. Hey, we got shot at by a tank for 3 days in a trench with no armor. And we had 5 guys who died, unfortunately, but 35 of them were wounded, and all of the wounded lived. Only one needed an amputation. That feels good to hear. If I got shot at by a tank for 3 days, I'd be dead on day 1, right? So hearing that you've made a difference, having people say, hey, we're the doctors with such and such battalion, and these guys came and they had already treated themselves so well that we sent 60% of them onward without having to stabilize them more. This is a thank you to whoever their instructors are. Getting a message like that makes your heart swell. Probably why, the biggest thing that motivates me there. So there's good with bad. It's an industrial war at an industrial scale. So you have to have an industrial level of effort. And so even though we trained arguably, somewhere between 4 and 5 battalions, it still doesn't feel like that much because there's a million soldiers, right? So doing 1/200th of that isn't quite going to be all you need.
Yeah, I can imagine that making an active choice to what kind of friendship you kind of engage as well, and relationship to the soldiers is probably smart. As you want to basically make sure that your performance is as good as it can be, then detaching yourself a little bit from those soldiers. I guess if that's what you mean, if I'm interpreting right, that's probably a smart choice. It's a really difficult and industrial scale war, which we haven't seen in years and years, and I think most people would be impacted by the loss of life, and the psychological aspect of that could probably for most people be a big issue if you want to perform as good as you can. And yeah, as you're planning to head back, and I'm happy you are. I think you're doing an absolutely amazing job over there, together with the team that you have over there and the people you work with. And I hope you can continue to do that and take care of yourself as well at the same time.
Yeah, I thank you for that. It's because I've lost people who I cared quite deeply about, and I've also been around losses of people that I knew less consistently, and you can kind of get numb to one. It's hard to get numb to the other as much because, especially if it's someone you're close to, it can be more deeply traumatic. And so that was why sort of very early on, I would say, hey, like, we'll talk and we'll be friends, but like, I'll go around, I'll ask you guys your name, and I'll laugh that, 20 people here all have the same name or whatever. But I'm not like, I don't need to see like all the pictures of your family and all that stuff. We had one guy, it was very early on, and I have no idea what happened to him. But we was like the day 3 with one unit. And, you finish up and guys are taking patches because I had a stack of little American flag ones to give away and stuff. The idea being not that like they can buy an American flag in anywhere, right? You can buy mine key for $2, right? But it's the fact that you got it from somewhere. You got it from, an American came here, a British man came here, a German came here. The Germans, we had a couple Germans on our team, and the Ukrainians love them, love the German patches and everything from the Bundeswehr, and just, some of the guys had been Alpine soldiers. And so having that sort of like, tough thing, it was really cool for the Ukrainians. As a consequence, guys would be like, oh, here, take this. And one guy gave me his name tape. I didn't realize like what he was handing me. And I was like, man, what are you giving me your name tape for? The thing that says your name on here. He's like, no, you're going to take it. It's going to be great. And he's like, it sounds like something. I was like, no, you're going to take it. You're going to take it to America. I was like, bro, like, I'm not ready for this life quest here. Like, just take your tape back. So because you can't get that emotionally involved because a lot of good people die. Another question from Swidgen: are defenders facing mental/emotional/psych issues, taking advantage of the resources that are available? Or are they stuffing these issues away to soldier on? Is self-care part of the toolkit? I'd say soldiers are not as actively using resources as I would like. The resources are also stressed by a large number. Something that is useful is we live in the age of technology and intercommunication. So as a consequence, if you have Wi-Fi, you can video chat your loved ones, for instance. So there are also non-formal ways of therapy and stress mediation that people take advantage of. and having that direct line and a video conference to your family or your loved ones can make a big difference. And I know that that is wildly prevalent. So while there are a number of people who just kind of keep it to themselves, and I suspect you're going to have issues with that forever, there's also a lot of people who utilize their own family resources, support structures, because they have access to technology that allows them to do so.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the upcoming season. We had a chat about it together the other day. Winter is here. It's cold in Ukraine already. People are in wet trenches, and during day it's often raining and wet, and during night it might dip below zero. These are really hard conditions for people on the front line. And I wondered if you had prepared yourself as well for the winter, and what kind of advice you would like to transmit to the soldiers as well, if you're going to put any emphasis on personal hygiene and winter clothing as a part of the training.
Absolutely. So we were mostly dealing with heat exhaustion and heat stroke while we were out in the east during the summer, because temperatures would frequently be over 25 degrees Celsius, or getting closer to 30, getting closer to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And when you're wearing heavy steel armor, you're maybe not in the best shape. You're not drinking enough water. You're smoking a lot. You're drinking energy drinks. People can get sick and pass out or have heat stroke. In the winter, and when I got there in February, it was not as cold. It was a pretty mild winter by all accounts. I brought some pretty extreme cold weather gear, stuff I use in the mountains in the western United States. And that's actually still in Ukraine. I left it there with the expectation of coming back for, in that this winter could be quite cold. There's a lot of activity that need to be modified when you're in cold conditions. Water becomes your enemy in some ways, because it's one thing to be cold. It's another thing to be cold and wet. And anybody who's done both can tell you the difference is substantial. Doing things like changing your socks appropriately, making sure your feet aren't wet in the mud, and there's certain things you can do to prevent that. Keeping yourself warm at night. All of that, just as far as prevention, makes a big difference, because last year there was a huge number of casualties on the Russian side, certainly, I believe on the Ukrainian side as well, unfortunately, that came from essentially frostbite and hypothermia. I know there was a lot from Russia at the very beginning of the war around Kyiv, and ultimately the ways that they tried to modify that led to more of their vehicles getting destroyed because they were just sitting in them to stay warm. It's, think about like a camping trip, but you can't choose to go home, right? Otherwise, there's certain aspects with medicine itself, because when your body uses blood to thermoregulate, so even on very hot days, if you lose a lot of blood, you can very easily become hypothermic. That's why you'll often see people wrapped in emergency blankets, either in sort of mountain rescue or even in just general trauma, because if you lose an appropriate portion of your blood, then your body's temperature is going to cool quite quickly, which can lead to hypothermia, and from there a host of other issues. So keeping people warm, already a bit of a challenge in the summer. We've had people who are coming back hypothermic in 25-degree weather because they had lost so much blood. It's not going to be any easier when the temperature is -5, -10. So you have to work on preventing it as quickly and as early as possible, which is something we try and focus on in training, not waiting till somebody is cold, because if you're using, say, an emergency blanket, you're just reflecting their heat back at them. And if they're already cold, you're not going to get much heat. If you do it right after they're wounded, while they're still warm, then it will preserve them longer and for more success in the future.
Yeah, so winter warfare is really, really difficult, and there are some basic rules and that I know can help, and one of the most important one is to have good shoes and maintain your shoes. Synthetic based shoes can easily get destroyed in these really, really difficult situations in the trenches. If you have leather shoes, though, you can make those last very, very long if you maintain them properly. And it needs to be done regularly. And then another tip that I have to anyone is to make sure that you use mostly woolen underwear and base layers if you can. And merino wool is a favorite among many people. It is expensive, but any woolen base layer is going to help you a lot, also because it keeps its thermal properties even if it's wet, and it's easier to dry, and also it keeps its thermal properties even if it's dirty. It has some natural substances that keep it more or less in shape even if you sweat in it and you get dirty, which you will do over just a few days in a trench line. Having change of socks is also very, very important, and making sure that you check up on your other companions in the field and do a feet check is an advice I have. So every day before you get your rest, make sure everyone in the tent or in the trench, in the bunker, takes off their socks and check your feet, make sure they're okay, and dry them off. Don't leave them with the socks on. Try and dry them out in your sleeping bag. Those are some few advices that I have from winter warfare training.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah, I hope so. And there are lots more as well, and we can probably talk for an hour about different things about winter warfare. But the equipment is very important. But if you don't know how to use that equipment, even if you have the most expensive, fanciest winter warfare gear, it's going to be a problem. So I guess we can go to the next part. Jonathan, I know you have a picture that you want to talk about, and after that, we'll do a little bit of talk about the front lines. So please stay with us, language, and thank you. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Mic check one. Mic check.
Good, Jonathan.
Good, Jonathan.
Oh, good. Right. Okay. So, dear listeners, our painting, well, I should say our picture for the week, for this week, which is our second in the Tochnyi series of Picture of the Week, is the one you're looking at presently. It's called Portrait of a Young Girl. It's by Nikolai Kuznetsov. It was painted in 1891, and it's currently in the National Museum in Warsaw. This painting comes from a recommendation from the excellent Twitter X account, Ukrainian Art History. Please give Oksana's account a can. Her work is remarkable. So, Nikolai Kuznetsov was schooled in Odessa in Ukraine. His artistic aptitude was discovered early on, leading him to enroll in lessons at the local drawing school. Ukraine was, of course, ruled by the Russian Empire during his life. So from 1876 to 1880, he moved to the Imperial Academy of Arts. He was considered apparently a diligent student. We all know how school records can come back to haunt people or be changed retrospectively. But he often left the academy to paint at a local family estate, and during this period, he defied his family's wishes by marrying a working class woman employed there, but one he obviously was quite taken by. Post-graduation, he exhibited his work extensively in Russia and Ukraine, earning numerous commissions, which was absolutely vital, of course. Notable individuals who sat to have their portrait painted by him included Peter Tchaikovsky. Kuznetsov had a notable robust physique, which also made him a sought-after model for fellow artists. That changed, however, after an 1889 accident that left him on crutches. Kuznetsov thereafter worked exclusively in a studio on his estate, which became apparently, I quote, a hub for the creative community. However, and I stress if you envisaged something like a hippie commune, long hair, drawn out, rather abstract conversations about a topic that perhaps could go without discussing in the first place, I am sorry to disappoint. These people lived under the boot of the Russian Empire, so they had to sell their work, or they'd all perish in destitution. So in 1893, somewhat recovered, Kuznetsov relocated his studio to Odessa in Ukraine, resumed exhibiting. So in between the accident and this point, he painted this picture. This portrait is one of three very notable portraits of the year of 1891. He painted women during this year, and they have made quite a considerable impression upon art collectors across the world ever since. In 1897, he traveled around a bit and returned in 1897 back to Odessa. By 1900, he had attained the rank of an academic and joined a local conservatoire for the artists. That same year, he showcased his work at the exposition Universelle in Paris. Subsequently, he traveled to Europe. European exhibitions were very keen to have him. Thereafter, in 1920, amidst the Russian Civil War's upheaval, he and his family emigrated to Yugoslavia, eventually settling in Sarajevo, where he died in 29. This, of course, was a time where a lot of other Russian artists and composers chose to emigrate from the former Russian Empire. Composers such as Rachmaninoff traveled to the USA. So to wrap this up, this remarkable artwork contains specific aesthetic characteristics within a two-dimensional visual framework. The components of this visual language, its shapes, lines, colors, tones, and textures are employed in diverse manners to produce sensations of volume, space movement, etc. What we want to know is via the chat box or via DM on our Twitter X account, what you think of this painting, what this portrait evokes for you, what in Ukrainian identity in 2023 you think it represents. Perhaps it represents the defiance of the Ukrainian spirit and reminds us that the enemy Ukraine faces in Russia is a tyranny in which such defiance in women, as pictured here, is not only brutally suppressed, it is legislated. So please let us know, and thank you everyone who's tuned in.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. That was an amazing presentation of the picture, and I guess an encouragement to our listeners and viewers. If you have a picture you want us to show at the picture of the week, we're going to try and do this in the coming Tochnyi weeklies. Please submit them to our Twitter or send a DM to our main account or any of our personal account, and we might bring it up. Or if you want to come and talk about the picture, that would be welcome too. So thank you, Jonathan, again. I would like to talk about some of the situation at the front line, and I hope you can join me here, Language, if you're available. So what I have done is that I have made a little time lapse of what has happened in the area of Avdiivka here over the last month and a half, really, since the start of October. And as I guess most of you know, Russia has done this insane offensive maneuver here, where they've sent in multiple brigades, and they pretty much mostly got slaughtered. But there has been some movement anyways, and even if Ukraine has been taking out enormous amount of equipment and soldiers, the Russians have done some advances in that area, and mostly in these human waves, because most of the equipment gets destroyed before it even reaches the front lines. But this has, of course, as well changed. It has changed the situation at the front line, and the Russians are putting pressure on the Ukrainians' positions in Avdiivka, and we're hearing reports from people there that it's really difficult to keep the Russians away from the urban areas, mainly because of lack of ammunition. And then I also assembled a similar video for what is happening in the Dnipro area. Ukraine has, as you may know, gone on an advance or several advances in this area, where they've established some sort of presence on the left bank of the Dnipro, so the eastern part of the Dnipro. There have been Ukrainians present in most of these areas, performing raids and preparing positions for quite some time. But the last few weeks, we've seen an increase in activity from the Ukrainians, and it seems like they're trying to establish some sort of bridgehead. I don't know how successful that is going to be, but it is interesting, and I don't know if any of you have any comments on any of the two situations. I think I'm going to try and share the map on the screen. Do you have any comments, any of you? Okay, so I don't know if you can see the map, but I think yes. What I wanted to highlight is that even though Ukraine has been mostly fending off the Russians in this area, and it's a very, very small advance if they do take it, it can be, some people have been drawing the parallels to last winter's Russian offensive in Bakhmut, but I think that, or in this situation, it's clearly different from one perspective, in that this is strategically a lot more important for Ukraine. It is close to very many important logistical hubs for the Russians, and very close to the Donetsk city. And losing this area would be of a tactical disadvantage to Ukraine. The Russians have moved closer over this railway line, closer to the industrial area, and I think that's a precarious situation. I don't know if Ukraine is going to be able to beat this back, but I think they would have to if they want to keep Avdiivka over a longer period of time. Do you have any comments?
I do not have anything at this time. I think, frankly, I haven't spent as much time over the past day or two looking at it. The biggest details around Kherson are just more troops moving across. It looks like Ukraine is committing to that, based on people I've talked to. It's not just going to be a hit them and leave kind of deal at this point. And then around Avdiivka, keeping the Russians away from the coke factory, or with like the chemical, north of the city, so they can't gain a foothold. Those seem to be the two major spots of action these days.
Yeah, also according to some people I know that have been in the area recently, the Ukrainians are trying to get a foothold, and they're not pulling away in any way or form in this area. They're preparing more boats and more troops to cross. And it seems like they're committing. I don't know how tenable the situation is, especially if the Russians move in more men and equipment. I've heard some rumors about more Russian brigades coming in to push this back. But of course, if Ukraine is successful here, it would mean a significant advantage. But it is very difficult, and I know that Ukraine is taking a lot of losses holding these positions, and crossing is mainly done in small rubber boats with small engines. It's not we're not talking about major crossings with a lot of armored vehicles, even though there have been some armored vehicles spotted crossing. I don't know if all of the videos that have been shared online is necessary these crossings. I see many people show retweet videos and put out videos of Ukrainian armor crossing that could seem that some of that footage is from training earlier. So it's an interesting development, and I think it's going to be probably the main focus of the coming weeks. Of course, along with that, creation it's difficult, and Ukraine really needs more ammunition. And this is one of the problems that we've been seeing for this whole time during the counter-offensive since it started in June. Ukraine really doesn't have enough munitions to sustain the sort of operations that they are actually conducting, and that's a major problem.
It seems like we might be having some issues with the stream, but hopefully there will be a video of this up afterwards that you can see. Apologies for the inconvenience.
Yeah, I'm sorry about technical issues. I don't know exactly what is going on, but we'll have to look at that for the next stream. The video should go up in full length on YouTube, and it should be it. I hope we get these technical issues fixed for the next stream. I'm very sorry to anyone that tried to join us. If anyone of you have anything you want to bring up, then please go ahead. Yes, Jonathan, I guess you can take over.
Mic check. Yeah, thank you, Erland. If any of our audience have any questions for our military team here at Tochnyi, our cultural team, please do feel free to submit your questions at any time. Anything discussed today is most welcome. Any questions in the chat are always welcome. We're happy to deal with any questions here at Tochnyi. Ukraine is our sole and only focus, and it will continue thus. So thank you once again for tuning into another episode of Tochnyi Weekly. We're very happy to have you in our audience. Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.
Героям слава.
On behalf of the brave.